Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Len.
I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Teaching in the evening. So since that is still a long way off, there's a great deal we can still do. Now, as Cyprian has stated, my name is Leonard Wanyama and I'm the coordinator of the East African Tax and Governance Network. Don't mind that it's a mouthful, but essentially we try to link tax to governance issues, mainly because our membership is quite broad beyond those who look at public finance management issues. And in our partnership with TGNA, I came to learn, different from what I used to teach in international relations, about issues concerning double taxation agreements. Now here, this was quite a long way off from what we taught about Treaty of Westphalia and whatnot. This was real-time issues happening today. And so this is definitely something that is quite interesting. And I hope we can manage to keep your attention for the next 30 to 45 minutes. Because as the relay has been described, I'll try to push things a bit faster. Now, in 2019, I think it was early 2019, TGNA won a court case against the government of Kenya, in which they took the government to court about a double taxation agreement with Mauritius. Soon after, the president had a second double taxation agreement, which is something that is ongoing. And quite recently, we went to Parliament to talk about it. Now, after that, as members who are looking at this issue, we had a strategy meeting about how to proceed. And EATGN committed to examining how we can train people better about DTAs in the East Africa region. So with that in mind, we've done a bit of mapping to understand how DTAs are manifesting in each of the 5 East African countries. But we hope when resources and time allows, we can also get a chance to look at how South Sudan is doing, because they are now part of the East Africa community. So this session is to try and understand that mapping. But we focus on Kenya. My colleagues here will kind of take us through a very conversational discussion about DTAs in Kenya. Since then, TGNA has gone to court a second time. The first time was for only one DTA, that is Mauritius. But now the second court case has included 9 other countries. Because of time, I think I'll just leave it at that. So at this point in time, other than just understanding the mapping and the effects of DTAs, my first task will be to kind of give you a glimpse on the DTA network and the pertinent governance issues. So I'll stick mainly to one. And then I will direct a question to Jared Maranga concerning to explore how Kenya is denied its fair share of oil and gas mineral resource revenues. And then I will guide the next question to Madam Mary Ongore in terms of understanding the context of DTAs and a phenomena concerning the NIFC and the court case, because she has a legal background. And with that, I'd like to introduce the two. We were hoping to be 3 of us, but unfortunately our colleague Ruth Musoti fell ill this morning. We wish her the best. But without much ado, let me start with my immediate right. Miss Mary Ongore is a tutorial fellow with the University of Nairobi and a member of the private law department. She's currently a PhD with the Maastricht University and has a law degree from Leeds with a master's in international law from Queen Mary University in London. She's worked for the London KPMG office in terms of expatriate tax and tax technology teams. She's also practiced in terms of taxation in relation to the Global North and Global South perspectives. And she is a member of the University of Nairobi Committee for Fiscal Studies. Now I'd like her to just start with explaining to us about what are DTAs, what are tax havens, what is public interest in litigation, and how do we kind of tie all this together? Because with her legal background, she would have a bird's eye view of how this is unfolding. I will then ask Jared, who is a former colleague at TGNA. He is currently head of tax at Resolute Business Advisory. He was also a senior manager at the Graphene Economics and previously a manager of international taxes and transfer prices at Ernst & Young. He will then talk about how revenues are lost, and then I'll be tying it in the conversational way that we're trying to put it across in getting a glimpse of the emerging treaty network. So Mary, please start us off in terms of just simply educating us on DTAs and the current context in relation to tax havens and the public litigation that's ongoing. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Leonard, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Leonard has already introduced me and given a brief overview of my background. So I'll delve into the issues. And to start off with, we'll introduce what is the concept of a DTA, what is it meant to do, what purpose is it meant to serve. So a double tax agreement is a tax treaty. It's a treaty between two jurisdictions that allocates taxing rights between the two of them, right? And by allocating taxing rights, the main aim is to avoid double taxation, right? Which is the taxation of the same income twice in two different jurisdictions. So what will usually happen is that depending on the model treaty that is used, and the model treaties are sort of like, to simplify it, would say templates that have been, not templates, but international standards that help countries decide how it is that they're going to negotiate their tax treaties, what provisions that they're going to include, right? So there are different models. We have the OECD model, we have the UN model, we have the ATAF model, we also have an EAC model, among others. And usually the taxing rights will be allocated depending on the particular model that is ascribed to, right? With the OECD model, it generally tends to be, simply put, pro-rich. With the UN model, it tends to be concerned with the interests of developing countries and securing their interests. And so that's in general an overview of what a double tax agreement is. So basically we decide on this type of income, who is going to tax what and how much. And the aim largely, aside from avoiding double taxation, is to encourage investment and trade between the two jurisdictions. Now, while this in theory is, it works on paper, it doesn't necessarily translate to the gains that are hoped to be achieved for various reasons. And one of them, top among them, is that the non-tax issues are usually a bigger concern for multinationals when determining where to invest in. And as a result, double tax treaties don't necessarily always result in increased FDI or trade between two jurisdictions. Yes, so of course there's a lot we can say about that, but that's just introducing double tax treaties. Now, on to the next issue. He has asked about tax havens. So tax havens are jurisdictions which choose to impose little or no tax on income that arises within their jurisdictions. And the aim of having this regime is to encourage investment and to draw people into to draw investment into the economies. And usually this will be because they're not necessarily resource rich, they're quite small, they don't have major ways of drawing income, and it's one of the ways that they've determined works for drawing investment. So of course, if companies are based in those tax havens, then the advantage is that they reduce their tax bill. And of course, a tax bill is a huge aspect or a huge factor in determining profitability. So the motivation is for multinational companies to be based in tax havens, and this is unfortunately what we call harmful tax competition, where several jurisdictions are competing based on using tax as a competing factor to market themselves as a jurisdiction that is open for investment, right? Now, I think the final question he asked was about scope of public litigation interest. Public interest litigation. Now, in public interest litigation, you literally are pursuing a matter in court on behalf of the members of the public. You're not necessarily the person that is suffering the loss. It is on behalf of members of the public, and this public interest litigation is something that has become important particularly in the area of tax. And as Leonard has introduced the issue, he's talked about the Mauritius-Kenya DTA. Now, Mauritius is what we call an offshore financial center. It's a tax haven. It has to put it politely, they have a regime that basically taxes a minimal amount of tax, but it also allows for abusive practices such as shopping. And treaty shopping is whereby companies base parts of their chain, their value chain inside a tax haven. And as a result, they're trying to benefit from a tax treaty that they ordinarily shouldn't between another jurisdiction that doesn't have a tax treaty with them, right? So Mauritius is abusive in the sense that for a long time they've been used to do treaty shopping. They've been used to do what we call round tripping. And round tripping is basically a situation where you as an individual bases their investment in a tax haven in order to benefit from their tax regime, whereas basically their own investment in their jurisdiction, if they stayed within their own country, they would have been taxed at a higher rate. So they're taking advantage of the beneficial tax rates in the tax haven. So Mauritius has an abusive regime, so to speak. We have what we call the global business regime. It has been flagged up as an abusive regime. They've tried to modify it, but ultimately it facilitates these abusive practices, round tripping and treaty shopping. And as a result, it has led to the loss of revenue for significant loss of revenue for countries that have double tax treaties with the country. So for instance, India lost a lot of revenue based on their tax treaty with Mauritius because of these practices. And Kenya, unfortunately, followed suit and ratified a tax treaty with Mauritius that didn't take into account the lessons that were learned from the Indian experience, right? So as a result, TJNA filed suit and brought a case against the Kenyan government, challenging the constitutionality of the tax treaty with Mauritius, discussing issues such as public participation. There's no public participation, challenging the fact that there were several loopholes that led to tax leakages. For example, taxation of capital gains being one of the areas that allows for significant tax leakages in the tax treaty, where this is because Mauritius doesn't tax capital gains, and this encourages people to place the investment at the level of a holding company in Mauritius and then get rid of the investment, and then capital gains tax are not the rightful capital gains tax is not taxed in Kenya, right? We have other issues, reduced withholding tax rates, among others. And so basically the treaty was a rather abusive one, and TJNA took took the Kenyan government to court. And there are several issues that played out in that case. Unfortunately, I believe, in my opinion, the jurisprudence wasn't rich enough, and it could have been a political stance that was taken. But ultimately, TJNA won, and like Leonard has said, shortly soon after that, we had the Mauritius Treaty again ratified very quickly and passed. So I think in the current context, it creates room for challenging tax treaties that are abusive, in the sense of ensuring that the proper process is carried out when ratifying tax treaties. Unfortunately, that might not necessarily mean that we have the level of public participation that we would have liked, given the way the case, the judge decided the matter. However, it puts the government on notice that people are watching, and I think it creates the opportunity for other governments to learn in terms of being careful and structured when it comes to ratifying tax treaties. I think that has answered this question.
Thank you very much, Mary. So, a little poll. How many economists are in the room? Just by a show of hands. How many lawyers? How many laymen?
Lay to economics and law.
Yeah, lay to economics and law. One, did that sound like Treaty of Westphalia? No. Definitely not. In the story she's just told you, whenever I read this, I always hear that there was a treaty by Kenya at a place called St. Louis in Mauritius, where the minister signed the second treaty. For us, we asked ourselves, if we are to build a movement that speaks to our taxes and these issues, and yet, how many can say they really understand what happened with the Mauritius Treaty? By a show of hands. Even lawyers sometimes don't really understand. Because when you start digging and you start understanding the economics, where we are signing things with no data, where we are implementing a treaty without following the constitution, and so on and so forth, it becomes very murky and very difficult. So for us, our commitment in 2019 was just to understand two main things. How many treaties do we have in East Africa, and with which countries? And that's what, if you've seen, my colleagues have put up some summaries that are showing on the screen. That is basically what we did with our study. So in terms of just understanding this, you have a treaty. The treaty has a problem where companies can choose to abuse your country, or citizens can also choose to abuse the country's tax laws. So that's the terminology she was using: treaty shopping and round tripping. But then there's also the undermining of laws. And yet still we don't understand how much of this is going on. So In our study, and unfortunately Ruth isn't here with us today, but she looked at the treaty network of Kenya, discovered since independence we had 48 treaties. After the new constitution, we came up with 14 treaties that were signed. These treaties are badly written, and there is increasing linkage to countries that are tax havens. So a direct channel or processes to 4 countries where you can whisk money out of the country. Now, of these, we see countries like the UAE, Netherlands, Mauritius, and Singapore have already signed new treaties with Kenya. And the same problem that was with the Mauritius treaty seemed to be reflecting in these 4 other treaties. One thing that these treaties guarantee is secrecy. And so therein begins the problem. And these are the loopholes that multinational companies are using to, as Jared wrote a few years ago for TGNA, trick countries through treaties. Now, as I mentioned, in Kenya particularly, we have the 4. But just to go through the statistics of East Africa, East Africa has a regional DTA of its own to increase its own investment, but it's not implemented because Tanzania hasn't signed. Of the countries that have the most DTAs in the region, you have South Africa and the United Arab Emirates at 4 DTAs each. You have Mauritius and India at 3 DTAs each. And then China, Singapore, Iran, Kuwait, the Netherlands coming in with 2 DTAs each. I mentioned about Kenya and its large list of DTAs. But then if Tanzania had completed its review and ratification process, it would have the 2nd highest number of DTAs, which would be at about 20 treaties. And then lastly, we are in a context in which Rwanda and Kenya are rushing to develop the national international financial centers, organizations that are being formed in a great deal of secrecy and lack of openness, which we are trying to understand. How are they going to be set up, and how could they facilitate the illicit financial flows? So if that is the treaty network that is emerging, I'd like to introduce Jared to explain to us, if you take one treaty, which is the Mauritius treaty, which he had examined, what are the ways in which illicit financial flows can happen? How can multinationals use a treaty to then disadvantage a government and reduce its opportunities to raise domestic revenue mobilization? So Jared, kindly come forward and welcome you to present to the audience.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jared.
Is this thing working?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. First of all, thank you very much for having me to speak today. It is my pleasure to share with you this platform and essentially to learn various aspects, especially in double tax agreements and how they link with what you're calling extractive sector. I think when I look at the agenda, that is the big issue. So probably my colleague has highlighted quite a number of things as regards to double tax agreements. If I'm going to mention, probably I might do some repetition. However, I'll try to contextualize so that I can slightly bring a different angle on how we should look at tax treaties. So the first thing probably to mention is that, because I had, the objective is learning. So how do we read and interpret probably tax treaties? I think is very important. And then try to contextualize it, to put it to context on whatever we are trying to look at. So if you look at standard tax treaty, you realize that it's been subdivided into at least 4 or 5 sections. One, there is a pure introduction, which is giving you who are the parties to these tax treaties. So you realize then you find either Kenya, Mauritius, as they have mentioned, they will be the main parties to these transactions. And then they will identify what kind of taxations are covered under these treaties. And specifically, in most cases, you find tax treaties cover income tax. So again, if you look at it from that angle, there are other taxes which need to be looked at, but mostly it looks at income taxes. Then there is an aspect of what definitions are contained in these treaties, so that you can be able, when you're reading through, you're able to link and say, when you're saying contracting state, what does it mean? And how does it come about? Another thing is, then the key sections which you're going to find are the sections speaking about the income tax. And that is, I think, the main focus. Which kind of incomes have been specifically or clearly identified by this tax treaty? Is there an income that you think could have been specifically identified and is not within this treaty? And can it be brought into the treaty? Or does it provide room for that aspect of maybe tax planning or tax avoidance? So that's something else we need to. And then the treaty equally provide like a self-review mechanism. So you find within the treaty, there are relief provisions or articles which provide on how you either manage or implement these tax treaties. So those articles are equally contained. And finally, you find some level of administration. When does this treaty come to effect? When does it come to force? And where was it signed? And who signed it? All those things are within the treaty. So if you're able to understand that one, then you can easily now look at it. Which area am I focusing? Which kind of income do we want to look at? So for instance, if you're looking at the extractive sector, you realize this is a very complex industry. It's very complex because probably the level of investment required to set up an investment, an extractive company or to do extractive process is very high. So then now you start looking at which steps am I going to evaluate to see probably the avenues through which the treaty is going to be abused and which kind of abuses are likely to come up. So then, in my view, the best thing could be looking at through the life cycle of the extraction process so that you can be able now to break it down so that you can easily identify what level, if it's at negotiation, what could be the possible avenues that this treaty provides that can guide probably avoid companies to avoid taxes at the negotiation level. Then there is aspects of survey and probably exploration. What happens in that situation? So if you're able to break it like that, then you can easily now go straight into the big issues that we are talking about. So anyway, that was not my major agenda today. It's just to provide a brief on what we should look at. So the key thing I'm going to mention about today is purely how treaties are probably used to avoid paying taxation. And I think my colleague mentioned the major aspect. One is through treaty shopping. And then there is that aspect of round tripping. So the issue is understanding how does tax treaty shopping arise and what can motivate an entity to plan or come into tax treaty shopping. So the key thing here is looking at the difference in the rates of taxation that are maybe applied in the various tax jurisdictions. You realize that there are countries which have very low tax low tax rates, and there are those who have high tax rates. And when there is that difference, probably a company might want to take advantage of the tax rates which are existing because they are in business and probably they might want to retain as much as in terms of retained earnings. So then the challenge comes in, probably they might not have operations in that country and they want to set up to take advantage of that. But how do you take advantage of that if you don't? Then that is now when we start looking at how can you model your operations in a way that you're able to take advantage of that tax benefit, which is visible through the tax rates that are existing in that country. And one of the things you look at is which kind of treaty network does this country has, and then you look at your investment and see, do you have any way you can be able to take into that? And that is then ultimately a company will structure its operations. If it has operations in another country that has a treaty with the country with low tax rates, then most likely they might route their investments through that country. And then ultimately they will take advantage of that tax benefit. So that is essentially what we qualify to be a tax treaty model, tax treaty shopping model. But now, if you have rooted, I think the challenge is now, where is substance? I think that's the question. Where is substance of the kind of transactions which are going to be considered or to extend this benefit to this entity? And I think now that is the question we are trying to ask here. Probably what is bringing about what is now globally known as base erosion and profit shifting. Because essentially, if you don't have substance in a given country and you're routing your investments through that country, then what that means is you're just eroding the tax base from the country of operation through the country where you think you can run your operation through, but no operations are carried out there. And then you take advantage of the benefit, and then you deny the country of operation their rightful share of tax. But again, I think with the developments of BEPS, we've seen so much that has been put in place to cap some of those practices. So another challenge is what we have as round tripping. Round tripping, she has explained it very well. But if you go to some extent, somebody will tell you there are so many objectives of doing round tripping. And, but in extractives, you might realize because of the level of investment, somebody will be willing to pass his investments to another country and then bring them back to take advantage, probably if there is a tax advantage that comes in with that kind of investment as foreign direct investment. Because generally, when you're picking your assets from your country and taking them to another country and then invest them back to the same country, through that country, then what that means is in your books of account, you're going to have an in and out. Generally, it will be capital out and capital in. And the same thing is going to happen in that other country. Capital in, capital out. But now, ultimately, this person has structured his investments in a way that if there was an investment as a result of foreign direct investments, let's assume you're going to get like 100% investment allowance. If you routed that investment like that, definitely you will qualify for what? For that investment allowance. And that is the tax benefit probably that person is looking at. So some of those practices happen, and when you look through the structures, you realize the drive probably is to minimize the amount of tax that you are going to pay in a given country. So therefore, what do we need to do when it comes to looking at some of these aspects? I think is very important in this discussion. How do you minimize instances of tax treaty shopping? How do you minimize instances of round tripping? So number one, from the research we did on treaty, we gave some recommendations, and one of the key recommendations is what is contained in the action plan number 6, as well as action plan number 15, which is purely countries instituting minimum standards. And one of the key minimum standards is using the principal purpose test. In this case, as I've said, checking where substance of a given transaction has occurred is very, very important. So therefore, if you're able to ascertain that there is substance of the various arrangement in that country, then the treaty provisions will apply. But where there is no substance and clear purpose, then that means the country should deny the benefits associated with what you're calling the tax treaty. That is one of the minimum standards. Another minimum standard is limitation of benefits. So limitation of benefits will work like where you have, for you to qualify for a given treaty benefit, you must have invested a given level of investment in that country. In that case, what is the shareholding of this other entity in the country? So if you have at least 50 or so in that country, then you will qualify for them, because then we are assuming that this gives you like substance and a purpose in that country. Another general thing that is being considered to be included in all treaties is having general anti-avoidance rules. So as a preliminary, as I said, on the sections of the treaties, as part of the introduction, each treaty should be clearly state that the purpose of this treaty is not to enable companies to what? Do tax avoidance, rather to enhance tax compliance. And in that case, because she mentioned the objective is to minimize double taxations, all those things, or else exchange of information if they provide for that, and all other aspects that are contained in the treaty. So if we have those clearly stipulated, then in my view, we'll minimize the instances of tax avoidance as related to tax treaties. And I think most countries are doing this. She mentioned of India, Mauritius, and India did a review of their treaty with Mauritius, basically to minimize the avenue that companies were using, where they were taking advantage of 0% capital gains tax and routing the investments from India, then route them back to India so that they can take advantage of the capital gains tax. Because if they were doing the investments locally, they could have paid that capital gains tax, which was very high. So in that case, then I think that is one thing we need to look at. So let me just speak quickly on what key areas you will expect probably the tax avoidance mechanisms through tax treaties can occur when you are looking at the tax treaties. One, when you check how are you going to qualify an investment, whether it's a permanent establishment or is creating presence in a given country for it to be taxed there. I think if you look at Article 7 of the tax treaties, the standard one, you'll see the provisions of that and see how companies are going to, or countries are going to be able to implement that article is very, very important, because then you're able to say, with your operations, you have created a permanent establishment, and we're going to tax you here for all income that is going to be accrued as a result of your operations here. So for extractive sector, I think it's a very challenging aspect, because of, say, it is a complex situation. Sometimes you're working offshore, sometimes you're working within, and you're engaging so many parties to implement your extraction process. So then where are you going to say, because I can come and do my exploration for 2 months, am I going to qualify to create a permanent establishment? So it depends how the treaty has been worded. So those aspects of fragmentation, where you have contracts split between various subcontractors, creating challenges to establish when a permanent establishment has been created, and also when you are going to carry out tax, is a very challenging aspect. Another thing maybe you need to look at from an extractive perspective is the aspects of technicalities. As a complex industry, we have special experts. So players in these industries will make use of experts in carrying out their various activities. So then you need to look at how the treaties provide, especially on aspects of withholding tax. When are you going to tax them, and at what rate? Is it provided as a special regime of taxation? Because some countries are provided for special regime taxation, especially on this kind of sector. So that's another area maybe you might need to look at. Another aspect is that the investments required in the extractive sector is very huge. So definitely there's going to be aspects of financing. So we need to look at the terms of financing. What interest rates are going to be used? Are these interest rates reasonable? If they are not reasonable, then you realize that there is some level of avoidance, because ultimately it's going to be recorded as income from the lending country and is recorded as expenses in the benefiting country. For the benefiting country, you are reducing the reported profits, and for the lending country, you are increasing income. And if there is a tax difference between the two countries, definitely there is a shift of profits from that country. Another aspect is when it comes to extractives, there is aspects of the commission. And in that case, then either you have a bonus or so how are you going to tax these bonuses at the end of the day? Dividends which are going to be paid. So there are so many aspects you're going to look at from the income section of the double tax treaties, and especially if you realize that the kind of arrangement that is existing is between a country that has a treaty with the participating country. So I think some of those aspects is what I thought I should share with you at the moment. I know time is not on our side. I have to stop at this point in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jared. Before I continue, I'd like to stand guided by you, Cyprian, whether you'd like to open it up for questions or shift.
Could I request, if it is acceptable to Mary and Jared, and with your permission, that we bring in the next panel that is guided by Sibanda. And I request that the online friends and participants send in the questions on chat, and our colleagues here note their questions down so that we take the questions together, if that's permissible by you. Is that okay? Is that okay?
Jared? So thank you very much. I think let's let Mukasiri and team also to join, and then we'll take the questions after. Thank you.
You, Mary, don't sit far away. I don't know who took your seat. Jared, so that we do that, let's welcome Sibanda to bring in the next panel and see how we manage that. You can give Sibanda a mic that he can trust. A mic that he can trust. Is there a mic you can trust? All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. People, I'm from Zimbabwe. Make me feel comfortable by welcoming me. Where is the hospitality that I hear from the Kenyans?
Good afternoon.
Huh? All right, thank you. I know you love Mugabe, so at least we can see some similarities. So help me to quickly welcome here Francis, Charles, and Monica, who are part of the panel. So while they are coming, I'm going to briefly introduce them. I know they'll share something about themselves also quickly, but I start with Monica. So I had to Google your name, Monica. So it means to advise. So what basically we want is to pick your brains when it comes to artisanal small-scale mining. How do we fight illicit financial flows? How do we make sure that the people that are at the core, that are driving the mining sector, directly benefiting from it, are not prejudiced? So this is basically what we would want to hear from you, because normally when we talk about mining, the sector is forgotten. People like to talk about the big contracts, big investors, and forgot that and usually miss out. Then Freeman, Warrior, that's Charles for you. And I know that we are going to get ideas that are not boxed. So we would want to hear from you. Francis, I hear that you are frank. So we just want that quick, incisive analysis. So the objective of this session, number one, the principal one, is to discuss trending issues on tax and natural resource governance in Africa, but we are going to narrow down the conversation to Kenya, but it does not stop us to talk about other country experiences where necessary. The specific objectives, one, to discuss emerging pressure points and opportunities on tax and natural resource governance at country level here for Kenya. Number two, to strengthen common positions, sharing and learning from country and sub-regional and regional experiences on emerging natural resource governance. Then the last one is to reinvigorate advocacy work on strengthening natural resource sector, tax linkages, and upscaling the agenda of curbing illicit financial flows. I don't know who shared my WhatsApp number with the participants here, because I've got 32 messages saying Kasi take a lot of time. So I'm not going to respond, but let me make sure that I give the opportunity first to Monica. Yeah, feel free to compress three things. One, what are the current experiences are like, what is needed going forward, so that we change the game when it comes to make sure that people benefit from artisanal small-scale mining. Thank you.
Monica, do you want to present for this one or?
I don't know for optics. I think she will love the television.
Yeah.
Please come here.
Yeah. For the online.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Monica.
Yeah. Thank you, Mukasuri, for this opportunity. Very quickly, let me just start by saying that unlike the oil and gas sector that Charles, of course, is going to talk about, there's a dualism in the mining sector where there's the large-scale players, the LSM, and the small-scale and artisanal sector, the ASM. So I'm not sure there's ASM in oil and gas, but for sure there's ASM in mining. Focus has always been, when you talk about, I like what the terminology was used, decolonization of the sector, because the sector and the focus is always, when you talk about mining and oil and gas, is a big boys game. There's a lot of capital. So focus is always on what is the Western country coming to do in Africa. And we forget, even if you look at the mining licenses in Kenya, easily over 70% are actually owned by Kenyans, local players, right? Just focus this conversation when we talk about illicit financial flows. What we see for artisanal and small-scale miners is informality that is breeding illegality in the trade, okay? I was discussing during lunch break with someone, and I said, before we revised the mining law in Kenya, artisanal activity was actually illegal. And in most African countries, they're relooking at their mining codes because they realized as long as you make artisanal miners to be illegal, that's where a lot of the problems begin, because artisanal activity is a livelihood activity. As the gentleman has said, I think from Igori, when you say you're an artisanal miner, people need to eat, they need to feed their children. So these are investors of circumstances, not opportunities, right? So for the artisan miners, I don't think they deliberately want to be illegal. They do not want to do anything wrong, but you must make compliance to be as easy as possible. Don't make laws that are onerous for people to be able to become legal. And that's what the Mining Act of 2016 in Kenya sought to do, and said, one, if they're illegal, we cannot interact with them. If they're illegal, we cannot interact with them. So let us first make them legal, and let's know who they are. And by legalizing them, it means they can get permits. Unfortunately, as it's been pointed out by the lady from Transparency International, right? The information has not sufficiently been passed on to these artisanal miners. It has also not become very easy for them to seek these licenses, because structure, if you go to Migori, Kakamega, Taita, how many of them have that internet to be able to apply for a permit through the cadastre system? How many of them have the knowledge to be able to interact with the cadastre system? So you have legalized them, but you have also made that legalization not accessible to the people you want to assist, right? So there's work to be done there. You made them legal. How do we make it easy for them to get information on how to be legal? How do we make it easy for them to access and interact with the cadastre system? How do we cascade this information to where they are and make it easy for them to join the system? And when we talk about that, I cannot forget to talk about gender issues as well. Women are always marginalized further. So in addition to helping artisanal miner, how do we also help the women who are artisans to be able to interact with that system, right? So Mukasiri, the one thing that I think is happening in artisanal mining activities, and we've seen many countries doing this, is trying to formalize artisans. But unfortunately, most countries end at, as long as we can give them permits and licenses, they walk away. You know, and that's what I think I was very interested in understanding. What is the role of the state? What else do you do to these artisanal miners? Because artisanal mining is more of a social activity. You know, there's the youth, there's the women in there. You cannot say, we'll give you permits, and now that you have a permit, the next thing I want from you is tax. That is not possible. By who these people are, you cannot legalize them with incentive in order to tax them. It will not work, you know. There has to be other mechanisms that are put in place to help structure artisanal miners, you know. So you've given them permits. How are they going to access the land that they're mining in legally? How do they access that land? And once they access that land, how do they get the capital to be able to do the mining? And once they get that capital, where are they going to get the markets where they're going to sell that commodity in a fairly priced manner, in a transparent manner, where now the government can, over time, educate them and teach them and say, with a permit, with capital, with this setup, you are now legalized and formalized in such a manner that you should now pay a certain amount of tax for this activity. So it's a whole process, and from experience and what I've seen from both the miners of gold and gemstones, especially for the miners of gemstones who I interact with in most countries, not only in Kenya, the issue of at what point are we paying the state, and what has the government done for me? I am contending in the bush where I have not seen any infrastructure or any support by anyone. But the minute I get something I need to trade, you tell me there's a 16% VAT for trading. So what am I paying for? And for what am I paying for? Is, you know, artisans cannot answer this. So let us not legalize and formalize miners in order for them to pay taxes. Let us first legalize them and set them up in such a manner that they interact formally with the system, start to realize the benefit of this economic activity. Then along the way, let's find out how we can add them to become taxpayers in that equation. When we talk about artisanal miners facilitating these illicit financial flows, this has been mapped out. It is true, and especially even in gemstones, at least for gold, it is bought a lot locally because it is used by local players. So if you're in Migori, and they will attest the players in Migori, you can trade off your gold in Migori. But for items like gemstones, consumption of gemstones is not for domestic. Most of the people, if I have a sapphire or I have a diamond, most artisanal miners are not preoccupied with wearing a diamond worth 250,000 shillings. They want to feed their children, they want to go to school. So by nature, that gemstone must cross the border to go to where it is most valued. And that's where the problems begin. You know, this is not something you'll detect. One little stone is worth millions of shillings, right? So the initiatives we're working on right now in the gemstone sector is to promote responsible sourcing of gemstones, where we are also telling the source markets, for sustainability of your supply chains, you need to come back and work with source countries. You know, the question where people are saying, we have miners who don't look like what they mine. A miner who's mining gold but is in abject poverty. A miner who's mining sapphires but is in abject poverty doesn't look like what they're mining. All stakeholders must come together and talk about responsible sourcing, where the markets also must want to share in the prosperity of the source of these minerals. And that's a conversation we're discussing now in the gemstone sector. And luckily, there's been an awareness and a sort of woke consumers who are now asking the right question: who mined my gold? Who mined my sapphires? Who mine my gemstones? And with this kind of awareness, it's bringing back attention to the source markets, where people want to do more for the miner, and they want the story behind that mineral. So do not smuggle from your source countries and bring it to us. We want you to be able to, we want to pay you fairly for the minerals that you have extracted, pay your taxes, so that even I, as I own your mineral as a consumer, I can tell the story. I can carry the story of the source market. So this is a new way of thinking, where it will ingrain sustainability, because people are more conscious about, they want to do it for the good of the people, the miners, they want to do it for the good of the environment, you know, and also for profit. It is business. And this model will breed sustainability in the supply chain of these minerals. So of course, any new way of thinking and any new way of doing business will always be fought. Old players in the supply chain are not very focused on this, because for them, information asymmetry is what has made people become rich in this trade. Where if I buy gold from somebody who is not very preoccupied on the value, or if I buy gemstones from somebody who doesn't know the value, it means my margins are higher. So if you're saying we're bringing information back to the miners, to correct information asymmetry. There's a bit of resistance from some of the players, but we hope with this new way of doing business, where we're entrenching responsible sourcing, we're talking about transparency, and even in the gemstone supply chain, we are testing blockchain technology to be able to safeguard the provenance of these gemstones and of these minerals, where you can say this gold is mined in Kakamega in Kenya from this mine, and you can trace the supply chain, you know, and also trace who got paid, how much did they get paid, was it documented when it was leaving the country. We're hoping this new way of doing business will also curb the illegality in the supply chain when it concerns artisanal miners, and actually bring more prosperity to the miners and bring more revenues eventually to the governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. So just quickly, you need to dissect the SM sector. Unlike the large-scale mining sector, this is a sector where we are talking about direct or front door way of empowering the people, because they control, they manage the resource. But I'm sure you have heard the risks that are associated with the sector. Can you allow me now to move to Charles, the warrior, the freeman? We want to pick your brains. How do we go about this? What are the experiences in Kenya when it comes to curbing illicit financial flows from the oil, gas sector, and the extractive sector in general? Thank you.
Check. Yep. So like my name is Charles Wanguru. I work with the Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas. I wanted to start first of all by giving sort of an overview in terms of internationally, domestically, and then try and go into how that has an impact on IFFs and domestic resource mobilization. I'll try not to repeat what a lot of people have spoken to earlier today, but the key conversation in the oil and gas sector is around the energy transition. So internationally, and a lot of speakers have spoken to this today, there's a sort of a big shift away from fossil fuel. To realize that also, as we speak about energy transition, speaking of energy transition in the middle of a lot of African countries actually making discoveries in the sector. So I think as recent as last week or the week before, South Africa has made significant discoveries offshore. And so what we're likely to see is that we are going to see a lot more finds. Mozambique, of course, has a discovery for gas, as well as Tanzania. So in that context of the international trend of speaking of energy transition and moving away from fossil fuels, the current context is that we are discovering new resources on the continent, and that has an impact in terms of how we go forward. Even as we speak of that discovery, the current trend is that 84% of world energy comes from fossil fuels. And that's something that's not going to change overnight. We're likely to see sort of 10 to 12 years of demand. And then after that 10 to 12 years is when we're likely to see a sort of a slow decline. So this idea that, we'll just sort of wake up in a fossil fuel free world, that's not going to happen. And the best illustration at the moment is that even when you look across the room, a lot of the people who are wearing the N95 masks, that's actually an oil product. The N95 mask is actually made off of fossil fuels. So in illustration, I mean, the need and the demand for it still exists even in the current COVID climate. The second conversation is around stranded assets. Because of course, if we're moving away from fossil fuels, so what happens with all these new finds? And so there's a big conversation around stranded assets. And lastly, it's the collapse of the oil price, especially with COVID. So what does that mean for the sector when the international price has gone down? And so how does Kenya, for example, which needs to build a pipeline worth $2 billion US, where is that financing going to come from? Same with Tanzania and the Ugandan pipeline, which needs, again, at least about $1 billion to build a pipeline to get it out. So where does the money come from? But domestically, we also have challenges domestically, and I won't repeat too much. We have a debt challenge in terms of the euro bonds that we've borrowed, a lot of the foreign denominated debt that we currently hold. And that is sort of made worse by the fact of the impact of COVID on our economies. So the collapse of tourism, for example, the challenges with horticulture in terms of export has meant that the traditional forex earners for some of our countries are sort of under peril at the moment, which sort of makes it more, it increases incentive to look at other opportunities for forex earning. And so mining and oil and gas, again, become more crucial in that kind of context where we're trying to get as much forex to enable us to service our debts. But so what's the impact of that on the sector? Firstly, very little activity is happening at the moment. And companies are also pushing for a better deal. So in illustration, Kenya had removed some tax incentives around oil and gas exploration as a response to COVID. So sort of the finance ministry looks at the tax incentives that currently exist and had pushed to remove a lot of those incentives to ensure that the country actually increases its collections. But what happens immediately after that? One of the oil companies gave a force majeure notice. So force majeure notice means basically that due to developments, they are unable to continue. And what happened after that? Government had to call in the companies and sort of start renegotiating again around the removal of those incentives. And some of those incentives have been put back, right? So that's one of the challenges actually at the moment in terms of trying to ensure that you're getting more value for the resources. I think Professor Waki had spoken to this, another challenge around negotiation. How do you negotiate for the best deal when you're in a bad position? Because like I said, from the context, we have to service our debts, we need more money. So you're desperate. When you're negotiating from a desperate position, it's very highly unlikely that you'll get a good deal out of that. And then another challenge is sort of the stranded assets question. So when the international conversations around stranded assets, countries feel pressure to try and realize their resources before that window closes. So while I said, for 10 to 12 years, there'll still be significant demand for fossil fuels. When you speak of stranded assets, and I've been in a lot of rooms now where the stranded assets conversation comes up, a lot of countries now become desperate. And it's what Alvin sort of said for the race to the bottom. So if you're saying there's only sort of 10 to 15 years of fossil fuel use, and you've just discovered gas, or you've just discovered oil, the first thing that you want to do is to make sure that you get your assets to market. And how do you do that? By trying to attract, sort of highest investment, by giving better deals, by giving sort of a tax incentive that we've spoken about. So that's a challenge that exists in terms of being clear about what's the trajectory for fossil fuels, so that when you're negotiating as well, that you're negotiating it from a good position. But if the talk is around stranded assets, then there's sort of this rush to try to develop our resources before that window closes. I want to end on my last point. There's a challenge now in civil society, especially in advocacy. And that's around the two competing conversations. So energy transition, climate change, and sort of resource benefit maximization. Yeah. So a lot of work has been done, for example, and I have to give credit to the tax justice organizations and its network around ensuring countries actually benefit from its resources. But now you have the climate change conversation, and what does that mean for resource-rich countries? And how do you get a common position in civil society when some members are speaking about leaving resources in the ground and the others are speaking, how do you maximize the benefits of these resources for the countries, right? So the struggle that exists there is that civil society, again, is dependent on donor funding and donor priorities. So the donor priorities, again, on energy transition and thing, how do you ensure that you as a national level organization, if your focus is on resource benefit maximization, how do you ensure that that conversation is still alive if one of the deliverables is to say, we want to leave the resources in the ground? I want to stop there and sort of welcome some discussion.
I think there are three things that but I picked 3 words. First, to talk about turmoil, oil, and palm oil.
Sorry.
Turmoil, palm oil, and oil. You said turmoil. I said turmoil. Yeah, I don't know how you pronounce it, but it said that you said turmoil, parboil, and oil. Yeah, causing discord. So if something is parboiled, it's half-baked. So you can see from the interventions that are coming in, the rush to exploit the resources with the parboiled frameworks that are there, trying to give tax incentives. So it's something which is half-cooked, right? So it's the danger that Charles highlighted, which can cause indigestion when it comes to development, because you don't have to take half-cooked issues. Then with turmoil, I'm sure some area speakers talk about violence that is associated with exploitation of oil. Then lastly, the discord among civil society. So Francis, you have heard the 2 speakers, but you are also from Global Financial Integrity. And they are also frank in terms of your Google name. So please just dissect it quickly in less than 10 minutes.
Kasiri, Francis Cairo. I am with Global Financial Integrity, or GFI. And before I begin, those who are from Kenya, there's something I learned from Zimbabwe. There's something they call totems. And Sibanda, the totem is a lion. And I think my friend here decided what use is a lion without a mane. That is why he decided to grow his hair so that he can become a proper lion. Yeah, I know that we are highly pushed for time, and I will therefore restrict myself to speak to the main issues. And one of the things I want to highlight here is in addition to what my friend who is a tax expert spoke about, how do companies escape tax? And then secondly, how then does government respond? And then I'll look at the issues that we need to think about during our stay here. One is that companies will undervalue the commodity export. That we know very well. Secondly, they will overvalue their marketing costs. They will also overstate their operating costs. They will also misprice services. And that is why we spoke about bringing in experts and how much we declare as having paid them. They will also not declare the byproducts they get. And therefore, that is why we sell just oil. But how many products, how many byproducts do we get from that oil? And do we even tax those byproducts? The other thing that companies will do is indirect transfers of interest. And this is done mostly using complicated corporate structures that will not be existing here in this country. This will be done in another country. And then they will exaggerate the decommissioning costs. And I want you to think about it this way. If they are overvaluing or undervaluing, who holds that information? It is them. If they're exaggerating or overstating, who holds that information? It is them. If you walk to KRA today, into the large taxpayer's office, and ask them for the risk areas they monitor, they will tell you they look at overvaluation of marketing costs. They will tell you they look at undervaluation of commodity export. They will tell you they look at mispriced services. But who is the holder of this information? And how can this information be used to tax if the holder of this information is the person who will be taxed? How can it be done? But then let us look at the other facet. How then does government respond? The Kajiado County government decided to levy 17 billion Kenya shillings land rates on Tata mining because there was no other way of getting Tata. So they decided the easiest thing we can do as the county government is levy land rates. How else does the government respond? Two is if you look at consumption taxes in Kenya as declared by KRA in 2018-2019, VAT grew by 12%, but customs grew by 8%. Very clearly, when the government cannot get taxes through that other side, they come for our necks through consumption taxes like VAT. And it is also important, I know we are looking at outbound transfers, but it is important to look at the other side when illicit flows come in, inflows. And this has happened. Venezuela, in trying to sell their gold to Dubai, they thought of our friends in Uganda, and they brought in gold into Uganda so that it can be refined and sold onwards to Dubai. Today, Uganda exports more gold than it produces. We looked at the statistics coming from I think it's called the UBA, the equivalent of the central bank. Last year, only 5 kilograms of gold were officially declared as exported out of Uganda. But if you compare with how much gold was received in Dubai, UAE officially, the figures are, it's unimaginable. And therefore, as we look at flows, let us also look at outflows and inflows. For the Ugandan government, it's a good thing because they're saying we have a big market. So I think it's called Anglo Gold refineries. They are some of the biggest taxpayers in Uganda. Is it okay to be taxing this illegal gold in our drive to build domestic taxes? That's a question for us. The other issues I hope we can consider is a lot of the information relating to the large taxpayers or LTOs is held offshore because that is where their companies are. Can government access this information properly for purposes of assessment of tax? When we do transfers, these transfers are done in tax havens. Can we use that information for purposes of assessment? Loan agreements or debt financing, the information contained in those loan agreements, who finances investments locally? It is not local banks, it is external banks. And how do we access that information for purposes of ensuring that whatever LTOs tell us is correct? And capital gains tax, I can tell you for free, it cannot adequately cover the tax for the sale of assets that occur offshore. It can't. And very few African countries today have enough laws actually limiting the amount of debt deductions possible under corporate income tax. These are serious issues. And when these interests that these large taxpayers sell, directly or indirectly, are done through complicated corporate structures, do we have the capacity at KRA, for example, to be able to identify these complicated corporate structures for purposes of assessing tax? And as I finish, I want us to think about other things that are separate from that. One of the things I want us to think about, I know that we are looking at policies that can address illicit financial flows in natural resources. But there are other natural resources that I want us to think about things like wildlife crime. And wildlife crime, this is why I think it's an important thing to think about in the context of illicit financial flows. If you think about the supply chain of gold, it is the same supply chain for illegal gold. It is the same supply chain for ivory. It is the same supply chain for pangolin scales. And pangolin is now the most trafficked wild animal. And most of them are found in our neighbors here, Uganda. And if you think about that supply chain, it is the same supply chain for mercury that is used in ASGM. And therefore, you're looking at a transnational criminal who is an expert in moving everything, who moves the dollars from our banks here to Uganda and to Congo, where the dollars are needed. The gold is then moved through the same supply chain to Kenya and Uganda, where it can be exported to UAE. The pangolin scales then move into Kenya, where we can use the Mombasa ports to export them. And because we need mercury to continue refining gold in the ASGM sector, they use the same existing supply chain. And therefore, as we look at illicit financial flows, it is important to see them from that perspective. The same supply chain is also used to move teak wood from South Sudan. It is used to move sandalwood, and one container of sandalwood is worth about 200 million Kenya shillings. And who are the people that are involved in that? You will find government of Kenya vehicles involved. And therefore, as we look at illicit financial flows, I encourage us to see it in those broad aspects and not to see it in isolation, because all these things are tied. And when government responds, it mostly goes for those that are easy targets. Thank you.
Yeah, I told you the guys is friend. I'm sure you'll agree with me. So three, I think, or four quick points. The first one is talking about government getting quarantined when it comes to information access. The information is offshore. So how then do you get to tax fairly without information? So it's not only the public which is starved, we suffer from information poverty, but even our governments suffer from that. The second issue that Francis raised is that he referred to me as a lion, and I was thinking, is there any way we can sue Hollywood for Simba the Lion King, so that at least we get a fair share? Yeah, but importantly, you spoke about getting paid fairly, and there is something that I want you to do for two ways. There's paid and charm. Paid, you block the P, you get aid. So what we don't want is to get aid, but to that narrative, let's add a capital letter P, so that we are paid fairly for the exploitation of our resources. You talk about undermining the under-invoicing, prices of our commodities being undermined. Then the other thing you talk about is the decommissioning cost. Look at it, the charm from our resources is blocked by corporates that are greedy. They block the sea. In the end, we get harm. You check it. Thank you.
So, I am looking towards Brian and the technical people, and it's now 4 p.m. and I don't know how much of online comments and questions we have. If you are processing that, we will appreciate. Don't move yet. Don't move yet. Mary is here, and Jared is right there. So Mary and Jared helped us with the Lenny Wanyama to look at the double taxation agreements and the many problems that are there. Identity of many advantages, if any. And then we have come now to the second conversation that was led by Sibanda, where from Monica to Charles And finally, concluding the conversation with Francis, we are talking about taxation and IFFs, and we have heard about the mining sector, the oil and gas, and Francis has brought us home with the various challenges that you can see there. Are there two maximum interventions that we want to make in the room on both the double taxation agreements and the tax and taxation and IFFs, so that if they are there, we take those. Let's start with the online ones, and then we can take one or two interventions here. Direct me to the more specific ones. What are the, so what are the sanction regimes in place in Kenya regarding banks and financial houses that facilitate the movement of IFFs? And what is the implementation status of these sanctions? Who is going to handle that? Leonard will help us with that. Brian, is there another specific one that you want me to okay, very good. Now let's come to the house where we are. If there are one or two prof there wants to say something, Monica, we will come to you. You can make a comment and also ask a question, and then you will be the second, then we'll conclude with Monica. Let's begin with Prof, please. Let's give him a mic. After those two, Monica and Leonard will intervene. Let's start with Prof, please.
I don't like asking questions, but when I get an opportunity, I do. I prefer to be asked questions, but I'll make a few comments. The first one is about saddlewood and wildlife. I like your candid presentation about how people make money from saddlewood and how people make money from wildlife. But I've been wondering in the privacy of my thoughts, why that happens, because that is an issue of regulation and law. If, for example, I was allowed to keep a lion in my place, or an elephant, or a leopard in my house, instead of a goat or a cow, I'm sure the value of these illicit broods would go down, or those illicit froze. So change the law, some of those things will come to an end. Why can't I grow saddlewood? By the way, is it impossible to grow it? Let's put that. I liked your charity of complicated financial structures. Are you saying that we don't teach those things in our universities for people to understand them? I think you can respond to that. Monica, I love your technology and blockchains. I'm surprised that artisans can use blockchains. I'm so impressed. I'll go home smiling. Finally, this issue of people not paying taxes, whether you are artisans or wherever you are, eventually everybody pays for it, because this is what's happening. When we avoid paying taxes, whether you're multinationals or artisans, the government lands short of money. So what is the alternative? You borrow. That's why the government is keeping on raising money. So the best thing is for us to start paying taxes so that we don't have the government paying debt. Because we are being selfish. Because if we don't pay now for taxes now, then our children will pay for the debts that we borrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's get the mic here. Bring the other one. Yeah. Have we run out of the mics? Thank you. This is the new reality. Yeah. I hope Prof's questions were taken up. Monica, there was, I think you made a comment on technology. He had questions for you, right? For Francisco.
Yes, good afternoon. Osika is my name. I have a question to my colleague, Mary.
Mary.
Yeah, I just, on the issue of the case, do you think maybe it would have been prudent for TJNA to approach the matter by way of a judicial review matter instead of how they approached it by way of a constitutional petition from a litigation perspective?
Yeah.
Because I feel that having, I mean, when the judgment was delivered, once you go through the specific constitutional issues that were being canvassed in the matter, and the submissions by TJNA vis-a-vis it's the burden of proof on those constitutional issues, specifically in the petition, I was of the view that approaching it from a judicial review angle would have been more better to seek these compelling orders against the CS Treasury and all the other parties involved, having regard to that the constitutional cases, Anarita Karimi, which deals with the matters that are supposed to be espoused in a constitutional petition. So to me, I feel that it was dismissed because I think maybe of poor draftsmanship, or maybe in a way it contributed to the matter not being really adjudicated as they had wanted.
Thank you. All right, so let's see how we handle this. I want Leonard to be the last one to respond. Let's begin with Mary, and then we go to Monica, Francis, and we see who of the other panelists has something to say. Then we conclude with the Leonard. Mary, start us off, please.
Okay, so thank you for your question. It's an interesting angle to pursue. I think the issue with the judicial review proceeding is that there has to be unfair administrative action, and passing. I'm not of the personal opinion that ratifying a treaty in a manner that's not necessarily in compliance with the procedures is particularly a procedural, well, it is a procedural impropriety, yes, but at the same time, I don't necessarily feel like it is unfair administrative action, because if you look at it, they're free to adopt, to ratify a treaty, and they were within their rights to ratify the treaty. Yes, certain provisions weren't complied with, but for me, it doesn't meet the standard of an unfair administrative action, because then the question itself is ratifying a treaty administrative action in the first place? And then I think for me, the concern would have been, if it was up to me, I would have pursued the angle of interrogating the question of the principles of public finance, especially when it comes to questions of equity, when passing public finance legislation. And it's a new area. It has been approached in certain cases. I think there's a case of Pevans, and it's a tricky one because the cases the courts tend to shy away from the question of equity, but I think it would have been ripe for exploration, and that's my take on it.
So the petition route they took was the correct way?
Because ultimately they are seeking to have the treaty making process. They didn't seek to nullify it, but they want it to be ratified in the press that they sought in the petition. So it's, if you look at it from a draftman's perspective, they are actually approbating and reprobating at the same time, because you cannot seek to have a treaty that you want it to be ratified, but at the same time they say it is prejudicial because the process was not followed. There was no public participation. Now, look, if you look at the arguments advanced by KRA, is that they don't have that mandate to involve the public in that process. So how then do you seek to have a treaty that you're saying the procedure was not followed in terms of public participation? How do you seek to have it ratified by, under the relevant section, under the treaty, that act that deals with the treaties. Yeah, so I look at it from...
I get your point, and I have heard Mary's response very clearly. I just posed to Mary, in terms of the question he asked, that instead of going to court with a petition, they should have gone in for judicial review. Your position is that the petition way was the correct way. It's on.
In my take is that the petition was a better approach.
A better approach.
I think it's. I think the petition way was a better approach. I think, however, it was a new area. It's an area that's not been tested before. And ultimately, even the way the matter was decided shied away from addressing the core issues. I don't necessarily think the way the matter was brought to court was the issue. I think it could be one of two things, and I have to be politically correct here. My take is that with jurisprudence on tax matters, it is difficult for judges to understand, number one. It's not an area that is often litigated as frequently as other areas, so say contract tort and so on and so forth. So for judges, it tends to be quite easy to make, I'd say a logical argument rather than a technically sound argument.
In this case.
Yeah, okay. And that's my take. I don't necessarily think the way the matter was brought to court was the issue. I think that the understanding of the issues was what was the problem, and that tends to happen quite frequently with a lot of tax cases.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Mary, and very excellent interventions. I want us to go to Monica very briefly, and Francis. I'm skipping Charles because we are having him in the last session, and we would prefer that Charles helps us in the final session as well by making certain interventions. Monica, please.
Thank you. Actually, my intervention was a question to my previous panel on what they're discussing. And I'll give it as a, I don't know how many of you remember the Macquarie law, where he asked that all mining companies cede 35% of local equity, to increase local participation and encourage more local ownership by these large mining companies. And at that point, we were also looking at the mining law, and a lot of things came up, and I'm shocked by the amount of knowledge in this room, because when we were querying how to go and work around what we faced, I wish this is the knowledge and the Kenyans who sat at the table with the government and the Chamber of Mines to offer the sort of ideas they're bringing now, because at some point we were almost being sued for being a banana republic because of asking for 35% local equities for mining companies. And at that point, we came to terms with some of these terminologies I'm hearing today. We had companies that talked about the country where they come from. They have an international investment agreement with Kenya.
With Kenya.
And then that company is registered in Mauritius, and the Mauritius company is the one that owns the Kenyan entity. And now that company has a double taxation agreement. Another terminology came up. And then that company at that point is when we're looking at the mining law, and they're contending about, why don't you give us a mining investment agreement? Now, all these three documents give them some fiscal allowances. All these three documents give them some way of dodging requirements, like, what percentage must be local component, when can you touch, and they kept on telling us, you're going to apply the law retrogressively because we're already existing in your country. And they were citing all these things we keep signing as why we're going to be taken to court. And I remember the other gentleman who presented, and he said one of the recourses, countries implementing minimum standards. These are three different things we're giving one mining company. And remember, before that company gets a mining license, it has already set up. They're not coming to ask for a license, then they go set up. They already come having all these things ready. when they're asking for the mining license. So my question is surely to you, Jared, yes?
Yes, Jared.
At what point do everybody sit, at what point do we get everybody to sit on the table, because negotiation happens with a registered company. You asking for them to go to parliament, that is at the end stage when we've already discussed mineral agreements and they're being ratified by parliament. So that's also the wrong stage. When we get everybody, when is the right time to get them on there? Can you put a requirement before you register?
Yeah.
This is the minimum requirements of the country of how you register to get a mining license, right? And then how do we build capacity? Like what Dr. Iraqi has asked. How do we build capacity? This is civil society talking in the room with so much capacity. How do we tell government this same knowledge of, we have a lot of issues of the fiscal regime at the State Department, looking at where do they tax?
Yeah.
What are the pre-tax arrangements by these companies before they come to interact with the mining law? Because they'll interact with Kenya Investment Authority first. They'll interact with KRA before they come to interact with the mining law. So some of those fiscal incentives have been given prior to them coming to the State Department. How do we use all this knowledge to advise government, advise people like the Chamber of Mines in the setup, to be able to avoid some of these issues? And then finally, to finish off on what was my presentation and what Dr. Iraqi has asked, yes, we're trying to test blockchain technology on artisanal miners because that's the only way we'll safeguard provenance of minerals from artisans to carry the story of where these minerals come from. Because it's by telling the story of the countries where the minerals come from that we ensure the value goes back to the countries, the source countries. So two things, provenance of those minerals, and the second thing is value addition of those minerals at source. If you add value of your minerals at source, you get more benefits from those minerals. Then ensure they don't lose the identity of what was the source country of those minerals. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Francis. Very briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Prof, for that question. I will answer it by giving a short story of what I saw once. I walked into a room and somebody had told us that he would take us on a trip. And he walked us into a room that was full of lawyers. We are talking about 40 or 50 lawyers with their laptops in front and on phone. And they were setting up companies on behalf of one of the biggest global companies. And their business was to set up at least 3 companies and open bank accounts for those companies and move the profits. So in a day, we move the profits of the main subsidiary 3 times. So you can imagine how long it would take the government to investigate how far the money had moved in 24 hours. So indeed, some of the things that are happening with complicated corporate structures, one, they will use nominee shareholding. They will use shell companies, a company that is established, conduct just that purpose, move the money in 24 hours, and in 24 hours, that company is totally useless. Number 2, they will use secrecy jurisdictions. And therefore, when you try to look for information relating to a company, you're almost floating in the air. We once did an analysis on behalf of one of the investigation units here in Kenya of a company and how many subsidiaries it had established for purposes of one transaction with government. They had established 17 subsidiaries in 8 tax havens, and the corporate service provider who offers that service is actually based out of Westlands in Nairobi. So the information is here. They know how to do it. It is not something that can be taught, because investment advisors, they will always try to stay ahead of government. They will always try to beat the system. So they will use the easiest loophole. The easiest loophole, like if you can use your grandmother's ID to set up a company, they will do that. and then use that company to move millions, and overnight that company is closed. So indeed, we call them complex because they use different approaches, secrecy jurisdictions, bearer shares, nominee shareholders, and within no time that company is just existing on paper and doing nothing. It's something that can be taught, and there's actually a civil society organization that is perfecting the art of mapping complicated corporate structures. So indeed, civil society is ahead of the curve.
Wow. Jared, I add what was asked by Monica. Do you think you can do that in a minute? Just straight away answer to Monica so that Leonard can conclude for us. We are really very pressed.
So I think, thank you. Maybe just to quickly answer that. Okay, the challenge is at what point do we get everybody to be on the table, probably when discussing? I think my quick answers could be one, the challenge we have is the discretionary way of doing things, where we have, like you mentioned, the mining chambers sitting down to negotiate with extractive companies coming on board. They forget there are other agencies which need to look into this. So the answer could be having an interagency collaboration will help to minimize some of these things. Because if you have tax KRA on board, you have treasury on board, and you have the Ministry of Mining on board, each of these ministries has its objectives and agenda. So if you combine this, then you have like a very optimal way forward as regards to maybe concluding on a given contract.
Thank you.
And then another thing is probably the aspect of beneficial ownership, so that you can be able to establish who owns what and where. Then from there, whatever Frank is discussing can easily be connected, so that you can easily understand who is doing what and what business. I think that is what I can answer as regards to that.
Thank you very much. Robert Suna was agreeing with you vehemently, because last November we were in Kampala with the ETAF, the Africa Tax Administration Forum. And what played out clearly, Leonard, you remember, is that the revenue body, administration bodies' objectives are actually at conflict with the objectives of the treasuries. All right? The objectives of treasuries is to get many companies in so that they can probably create jobs and whatever it is, but the revenue administration bodies want tax. So treasury is giving tax holidays, the revenue administration bodies are trying to look for the tax. Same government, not speaking from the same script. So you can see that the Ministry of Mining is trying to issue licenses so that mining activity can be increased. Different objectives from the revenue administration body, different from the Ministry of the treasuries of countries. It is chaos, I can tell you that. So, Jared, thank you for that answer. And I think it puts this problem in perspective completely. I want us to conclude with Leonard. Then we agree on how to take about 10-15 minutes to do the last session. And we have really to thank you for the patience, for allowing us to go this far. Leonard.
Thank you very much, Cyprian. So essentially, the challenge here of IFFs is we know there is illegal money, and Francis Kairu has talked about that very clearly. But when dealing with this, there is the legal means by which money is being whisked away. We put it into the category of illicit financial flows because we see it now as an immorality. Of course, this is now textbook definitions and whatnot. But in the case of Kenya in particular, why, and I'll put this in terms of the second question about the judicial review. I'm not a lawyer, but just in terms of the context. Why we put in a petition is that, one, for instance, no one had sat around the table, as my sister had asked. Secondly, the speed of how money moves, as Alvin had stated in the morning, by the whim of an email, you move from the UK to Mauritius. Then you have no DTA policy from KRA. So as they negotiate, no minimums, no standards, especially standards of national interest, especially if you think that the national interest is domestic revenue mobilization. You don't have that, so your negotiators are not guided. And then lastly, no parliamentary involvement. So essentially, you're undermining the law of the land that actually protects you and actually guides you. So in that sense, then the petition makes a lot of sense in that it kind of technically gives the opportunity for a lot of other advocacy, public participation things, and so on and so forth. And you can clearly see that there is a change in policy behavior. Now the government has been asking, come and give us comments for Singapore. Come and give us comments for Barbados. That's one opportunity, but still we have to re-examine all the other treaties. We have 9 others that went through the same process.
You're concluding?
Yes, so with that, on the specific question by, I believe it was Kwesi Obeng on the ones there.
Yeah.
And it's tied again to what you're saying, the domestic law. So if we talk about
and the sanctions.
And the sanctions. So if we talk about how is it happening? Again, if you look at the IFFs, we talk about their immorality and whatnot. But for instance, in Kenya, there is the legal and the security aspect. So for instance, monitoring terrorism financing, and this has informed a lot of the policy. So we find domestically, we are very strong on a law called Proceeds of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering, where every $3,000 is monitored. And so that is guiding. And we know that, for instance, the corruption cases today are built based on that, and it's very, very strong. So essentially you're saying, look, let's not lose confidence in the structure we have put up. We don't need DTAs to always come about and create new tools for money to be whisked away. Not really an extractive case, but what has happened, and I'm glad Mary had mentioned it, the case of SportPesa is a classic example. You have 6 trillion just moved out of this country. Annually, they have 100 million turnover, I think, something like that. No questions asked, thanks to a DTA signed in 63. That should be up for review, right? So this is the environment that we are operating in. And if you consider the 48 treaties, then we definitely have to evaluate it.
Good. Let's appreciate everybody in that round. I think it's Charles or somebody who was saying that he wishes that, it was Monica, that she wishes that government was having this kind of capacity, this kind of know-how, this kind of understanding of what needs to be done. Tomorrow I will be, maybe Charles can in the last session start to tell us why is it not happening? Why are we not working together for the interest of our countries? I mean, it's very interesting. But so thank you so much, panel 1 and panel 2, for the excellent guidance and the information, and we really have benefited from your work. Let's appreciate them. So Charles will remain there. We are requesting Wajuka and Augustine Masiga to come in. They will be introduced properly by the session moderator, Rogers Kidia, the program officers at TGNA. And we want to start to hear very specific things in terms of the implementing local content and the inclusive participation under the Kenya country mining vision. I'm doing that introduction so that Rogers can come. Has his mic been prepared? Yeah. Do you have your mic? Do you have a mic? We are talking about trusted mics now. Okay, you have one. So I hand over the session. If we can keep it to a few minutes, so we conclude with the energy still up there. Thank you, and let's welcome Rogers, please, to take us through the last session.
Fantastic. I have the impossible task of keeping you guys awake and also my panel engaged. So I don't know how I'm going to do this. Can we all just stand for a minute? Can we just stand? Just for a minute. Now we live in a very connected world. I want you to take your phone quickly. Take your phone. Can I see your phone, please? Have you ever tried? There's been some illicit information flow. So I want you to try your camera. Just see if your camera can take a selfie. Just try and see. Maybe someone is blocking something here. Take a selfie with your neighbor, like this, the way I'm doing. And then I want you to go quickly to our Twitter handle and use the hashtag. Brian, can you help me? Yes, this is the hashtag. Just quickly. Just use any fancy quote you learned here. Quickly. That's the hashtag. Can we have it back? Yes. Can you all see that? Yes, you can use fancy quotes you learned here today, like from Alvin that said, tax is the price we pay to live in a civilized nation. There was another fancy quote by Leonard that said, it is what it is, sorry. Financing and chasing minerals. So just use something quickly, and then once you do that, just take your seat. Yes, that is your license to sit. Fantastic. Talking about photos, and this one is addressed to my friend Charles. So in this particular session, we are discussing just quickly on issues to do with implementation of local content and issues of monitoring. I'm going to take us through that very quickly. And because of time, I'm going to round these things up like this. So this session, we are looking at implementing local content and inclusive participation under the Kenya Country Mining Vision. So I just wanted to show us this picture. I don't know if my colleague, yes. So that is me that you're not seeing. I was with Charles and Edgar 3 years ago. We had done a monitoring visit to Base Titanium. Oh, it's gone out. So we had gone to Kwale County, and the focus was, we just wanted to know what is going on at this large-scale mining operations. And we were shocked. We were shocked at the level of trade mispricing, the level of just complete abandonment of natural resources. So I wanted to start from there, Mr. Charles. So we are going to separate our discussion this way. So Charles will handle issues to do with the large-scale mining in Kenya. And then Kefa will talk about the hustlers. So the artisanal miners. And then Augustine will just help us. He will be the structural guy. He will take us through the institutional frameworks and all that concerning this discussion. So I'm just going to go quickly to my friend Charles. And so Vision 2030 in Kenya, just to situate this discussion, Vision 2030, which I'm really proud because I don't know if my professor was there during the National Economic and Social Council, whereby we were given the chance of going around to train people on the implementation framework of Vision 2030. And one thing that was very, very powerful and very strong in that document was that in that particular year, around 2010, the contribution of the extractive industry was only 1% to GDP. And the goal was, by 2030, we were supposed to have 10%. So if we try and just situate that, by 2030, the goal was to have at least a GDP of around $200 billion. 10% of that, how much is that? People went to school. That is $20 billion. So if you use that in a Kenyan system, that is around $20 billion. How much is that in Kenyan shillings? 2 trillion shillings. That's a lot, huh? It's 200 billion, yes. 200 billion shillings annually as a contribution to GDP. That was the goal. So right now, I was just checking the numbers. We are still around 1%. Almost 10 years later. So I want to situate this discussion this way. So Charles, please tell us what's going on in this large-scale mining, and also help us understand issues to do with petroleum by just discussing the process of how these petroleum basins were awarded, what's going on. You can also talk about what we are seeing in the screens about the base titanium. So you can help us with that, understanding the level implementation of local content, and in terms of monitoring, what are we doing as CSOs in monitoring the activities of the large-scale miners? Welcome, Charles. Oh, you can, please, just take it from there. Is that okay? Okay. Good.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think Rogers has confused me a bit because my focus is trying to speak on the local content issue, but I'll try combine that with sort of what you're saying around Vision 2030 and the building of that. I mean, local content, and I speak as somebody who has been following it for the last many years. Local content by itself is a very brilliant idea. Because what I enjoy about local content is this sort of idea that you integrate these new sectors into the national economy, and by doing that, you expand the local participation, you build the local capacity, and sort of work towards like the Vision 2030 in terms of industrialization and that kind of thing. At the same time, you increase the amount of revenue that's actually retained in country. So one of the challenges that we find is that, so let's say Talo, for example, now they say they've spent over $1 billion in Kenya in terms of the exploration and development of the resources in Turkana. But then you have to stop and ask yourself, but how much of that $1 billion is actually retained in country? So that has something to do with the suppliers that are used, the number of expatriates that are actually recruited as part of that process. And so that's sort of a challenge of retention of those services. And I'll give a very simple example. If you hire our colleague Wanyama to work in a local mine, his salary is based here. He pays the requisite taxes, sort of the payee tax and all those taxes locally. He retains all the money in country. When you hire sort of a similar person, but as an expat, he could possibly not be paid within the country. He could be paid at the home country of the company that he's working for. So the taxes are not paid here; they're paid there. There's very few limited opportunities for that. Any of the revenues that accrue to that specific role being in Kenya. And so that's just sort of like a very simple example. And you look at, and you compare that with countries, with other companies in Kenya, for example, around KenGen. So KenGen now is looking to expand into other countries. And so it's an example of sort of a locally grown company that has grown the capacity to be able to actually go abroad. And so That's sort of what you're looking for with local content. You're trying to build local capacity to actually be able to undertake the work that's required. But what's the reality, and why are we still at 1%? There are challenges that exist there in terms of, and the first big challenge is around fronting, for example, of companies. So you have a situation where accessing the contract is more important than the actual work, right? So, example in Nigeria, for example, where we had some work ongoing there. So the person who gets the contract is not necessarily the person who's implementing the contract. So you're trying to build a local capacity there so that you're contracting locally, but the companies who actually pick up that work and who have that capacity will not be that local company. So that local company who's trying to build capacity is basically outsourcing that opportunity, so that accessing the contract becomes more important than the actual work. So in the end, you don't have a local company that's building that capacity to be able to undertake the work. And we saw that happening again, it's not only in Kenya, and also in Ghana. So there's fronting of local companies, fronting foreign companies. So they are only interested, so the local company would access that contract, outsource it to a foreign company, and then so the net effect is that the money that you expected to retain within country by hiring a local company is not there, because that foreign company, again, the resources are taken abroad, and again, challenge before. Another big challenge is around governance, yeah, and I think my colleague Monica spoke about this, the information asymmetry that exists, so that the people who have access to the information in terms of availability of contracts or which contracts the companies will be giving out are sort of the political players or the people who are more connected. So they're the ones who are aware of those opportunities, as opposed to the people who you actually want to benefit from those opportunities. So that information asymmetry exists there, which is a bigger challenge. And it's sort of a governance, it's a governance challenge that exists. I think Prof was speaking, for example, around sandalwood. And sandalwood is a very interesting example, because at the moment you can actually buy sandalwood trees and plant them, but you can't export them. And so the people who have those export licenses are the people who are able to actually do it. Again, it's sort of the connected political players. So it becomes a governance. So it becomes for now a practical issue of what is illegal and what's legal to who's connected and who has access to be able to do it. Challenge around local content has been this idea of local content. And again, I'll give an example of a company that was building a road in Wajir towards an oil site. For every other kilometer, they had to drop all their employees and pick up employees closer to there, right? Because that community there didn't want the other community benefiting from that specific contract. And what's the net effect there is that you are unable to develop critical skills within those communities, because one person, you'll only give him money because you have to drop him. So you're not really building a skill of that specific person, because you know that you'll drop him. So you have to, so you mostly keep the more advanced skills at a higher level, as opposed to building skills of the local people, because you have to go dropping them as you move along. And so, I mean, these are some of the challenges that you find with local content.
Thank you. I'll come back to you later, but I just want to move to Kefas. We say that you are the representative here of the hustlers, and you work and coordinate people who we report often as being troubled by the extractive, these large-scale miners. There's no formalization of that sector. So my question is this: what is the significance of ASMs in Kenya, and what are the current wins that you've had? Let's start on the positives. What are the things that you've seen changing in the country? And you can end by telling us the challenges and what you're proposing all together. Welcome, Kefas.
Thank you very much. My moderator, actually, I will start by introducing myself as you did. First of all, I'm very happy that you have told me to speak on behalf of hustlers. I don't know to which context, but I will try to limit myself especially to the local English, because according to the introduction and the standards which have been set, I don't command enough vocabulary to reach that standard. According to my question, I was asked whether it is achievable, but because of time, I will actually try to brush so that we can manage that time. To me, as the one who actually understands the local context of artisanal miners, and as I stand here, I'm a miner, we can achieve this, but only if we close the existing gaps in the new Mining Act. Why? In Kenya, we have actually separated the artisanal and small-scale mining, which is not supposed to be so. For we to actually have this implementation done, we understand very well, especially when it comes to artisanal miners. We know that the categories of mining in Kenya as we speak today. And as we speak, we know that when it comes to artisanal mining, somebody told the platform that actually I'm mining illegally. And I want to agree before this platform that I'm doing that, not that because I don't want to pay taxes, but because the government does not want me to pay taxes by not allowing me to work formally. I will give an example on that. We have an artisanal mining committee which is supposed to be at the county level. As we speak today,
maybe as you talk about that, what is the composition of that council at the county level?
The composition of the county council, it is a challenge as we speak. And Migori being one of the few counties who actually started by forming their committees, the assessment has not been done. And that has been our cry all these years. So we as miners, the local miners, have actually tried to do our part by actually going by the law as it is, but that has not been so to date. When it comes to the law, those are the few challenges I was talking about. Why can we not achieve this? Most of the linear have been discussed. I will actually talk about 2 or 3. One, what you are asking me, there is lack of geological information regarding minerals to correctly advise investments. Why am I saying this? And that is why most of the speakers were talking about working with middlemen. Artisanal miners like working with middlemen because of 1 or 2 reasons. One, it is like when you may walk to the bank today and have a loan. Maybe you want to open a shaft for artisanal. Going there, maybe you miss the point. The bank will be on your neck maybe in 2 or 3 months. But when you work with the middleman, this is like a, how do we call it? This is like a, the best term is, this is like it's like a gambling, whereby nobody will come to you and ask you for what he borrowed you. So I think in terms of local miners, and when we work very closely with the government, especially the Ministry of Mining, we are supposed to actually formalize this thing so that once we have the license, we can actually go to the bank so that we have the equipment to identify exactly where we are going to open ourselves. We have this issue of law enforcement agencies, whereby now we are 4 years down the line. The formal gazettement of artisanal miners has not been done. So that one goes back to the mining department, especially as we understand that it still belongs to the local government, the national government. Our only part as hustlers is actually to do our part and form the association as required by the law and apply for the license permits. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Maybe before you leave, I just wanted to pick a quick question on artisanal and small scale mining in Kenya, if there's anybody, so that we save on time. Any question from the floor?
Allow me to add one point, if you allow me, just
please go ahead, as people are thinking about it. Yes.
I think there's this rampant conflict of interest in mining sector, especially at the county level.
Yeah.
Why am I saying so? When it comes to public participation, which is a very key requirement in the Mining Act, you will find that, like in my county, we have like mining, fishing, agriculture going on. When it comes to public participation, because of this, especially, and I'm not blaming anybody, when it comes to public participation, especially with our officials from the county government, you will find that what is supposed to be discussed by miners, the very, very key agenda is taken to where fishing is taking place. Why? Because that person has self-interest. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So what Kefa is telling us is, according to him, right now in Migori County, we don't have a committee, the artisanal mining committee that is required by law, by Mining Act. So that is something that I think we need to note it down as a way forward, because in all these counties, that is already something that should be working. I want to go to Augustine. Maybe Augustine, you can also take the dice. And I just want you to help us and discuss the issue of inadequate institutional capacity and all these issues about frameworks, all these laws. For example, we have the Mining Act. People are talking about different policies in the county government. As we know, there are issues that, according to the Mining Act, their minerals are actually a reserve of the national government. And then issues to do with construction minerals, or even coordination of access to communal land is at the county level. All these things, where is the we start 7 or 8%?
I would like to often, it's Augustine Masida. I work with Hakim Madina Kenya as the coordinator, and thank you for your detailed questions. Yes, I'm saying we are still at 1% because system that is made to work that way. And I want to build my discussion from there, that yes, we have the law, we have even at the continental level, we have the Africa Mining Vision, we have the Kenya Mining Vision, we have a Mining Act, we have now a Petroleum Act, regulations are there, but we are still asked to achieve it. Why is it that we have not reached 10% in terms of our contribution to the GDP? From the mining sector and from the extractive sector. Number one, I'll say, is that we have different institutions that have been set to govern this sector. For example, we have the Ministry of Mining. Right now, at least they have merged petroleum and mining. At first, it was energy, petroleum, and mining, different departments. So with that structure alone, from the government perspective, it's already a difficulty in moving forward in some of these things. Number two, we have other departments that govern the sector. We have MEMA, we have DOSH, we have even the Ministry of Lands, because mining happens on the land. So when it comes to valuation, we have to go to the Ministry of Lands. And even now, the government, in terms of national coordination, in terms of security, you have to pass through all these departments to be able to get something done. For example, For an artisanal miner to get their mining permit, they have to get land consent from the county lands board, or from the lands owner who has to go to the county lands board. He has to go to NEMA for some valuation and reporting. He has to go to DOSH. He has to go to the mining cadastre to apply for the license, to pay some cost to the county government before going to the committee that you're mentioning. So you find that because structures are not a one-stop shop where the miner can apply once to get whatever he wants, then that scattered method of doing things really is a hindrance on its own. Number two, what is our level of awareness about the mining sector? Let alone these people are within the four walls of this building. If we go to the community down there, how many are aware of anything about tax justice? How many are aware about mining as a sector? Maybe someone could be aware about mining because they come from Kwale, just based on the issue of land and compensation. But when it comes to revenue sharing, they have no idea. And someone was mentioning in the morning as I was here that the government sometimes is purposeful in terms of not implementing the law it has created itself. Because we have the Mining Act of 2016 up to now, the progress is there in terms of having the paper in place, but putting it in practice is a different story. And I think we are lacking the moral goodwill and the political goodwill to make the sector move from 1% to even 5%, leave alone 10%. So the political goodwill is not there. I don't know whether it's the interest that is not strong enough to be able to put it in practice. We have the BBI. I think it's Prof mentioned that there's just one word about extractive on the BBI. If you go to the big four agenda, I think mining is just mentioned as something that's supposed to have agendas. So other plans that are there, they just put there to just fill in the shelves. They're not there to really support the process. I want to mention a third point, the voice of the community. When it comes to the voice of the community, it has been left in the hands of the civil society. And we, as the civil society, are moving from speaking on behalf of the community and giving the community a voice to speak on their own. That's the direction we are supposed to take. And that's the direction we are going. Because if the community is given a voice to speak on their own, they'll be able to negotiate through now mechanisms that are existing. Before we had the Mining Act, the community had no voice at all when it comes to extractives. A company will negotiate the government and that's the end. But right now we have a policy that gives the community a chance to discuss and negotiate with the company through the community development agreement. You see, that's a big opportunity in terms of public participation in the process, in terms of sharing the benefits, and in terms of even engaging in the extractive process. So those are a few things that I can mention. I don't know if I'll get another chance to mention how.
Just a quick one.
Yes.
In relation, you've talked about BBI. I think this is something that is very relevant at the moment. So is it because of us, CSOs, who didn't present maybe our proposals to the committee, or maybe it was because of lack of a political will, something? For instance, let me just go to the floor. Which organization here presented to BBI on extractive issues? I'm throwing all ourselves to under the bus because, again, we need to interrogate all of us. We have to have this conversation, and maybe to add on that, talk about this issue. For instance, in Base Titanium, when we were there also with people from Aki Madini. The community around there were really complaining about the structure. In terms of structure, how do they engage? Who do they call on to? Because if they go to the county government, they are directed to the national government. And then when they go to the national government, they are told, go back to the county government. So if if people like that are actually watching us right now through Facebook and other means, what will you suggest for them to do?
Thank you for your question. It's a hard one, but one thing I will suggest is that those of us who are engaged in the mining sector, especially from the perspective of the community, number one, let's foster unity, speaking with one voice. We have to unite and find a direction to speak with one voice, because once we are one, as a community and as a people who are involved in the sector, we'll be able to move forward. Then number two, let's agree to learn and unlearn some of the state processes that we have. Let's be willing to learn if we have tried a mechanism. Say, for example, the people of BT community who are in Kwale, we're going to the county government to get information, then we're sent to the national government. They should first of all identify what is the role, who holds the role in making this decision. If it's about land, then they should direct their issues to the right people at that point. Then so we are saying let's learn and see who holds the last button about this issue. Then when we are engaging in terms of lobbying, we engage the right person in that engagement. Then number two, I will say that I think we need to be bold enough moving forward. Bold enough to move from creating awareness about issues, bold enough to move from trainings, and now move to be bold to engage, to confront. Now that we're talking about justice, to uncover, and I think just uncover anything that we feel is uncomfortable to us, by all means, so that we are not seen to be a lukewarm society or people that can be walked over, but be bold enough and engage. Then the last one, I say let's build our capacity, because we know that corporations, as my brother mentioned, they're bright enough. They have people with skills and ability to engage at all levels, whether it's at the community level, government level, or international level. Then even all of us, as we engage from the community level, let's build our capacity. If it's linking with the academia, so be it, so that we're able to build our capacity to negotiate, build our capacity to engage, and find all avenues and methods of doing our advocacy work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll now come to the last two panelists and just ask for your final remarks and what you recommend for either government or CSOs or academia to do in this sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think my comments is just that we need a bit more, I mean, from academia, I think more analysis on the actual impact of local content, especially with the current large companies, so that we understand whether the policies as they are at the moment are actually impactful. From civil society, I mean, more pushing for more transparency around local content contracting and similar things. And again, I mean, to government is just sort of creating that enabling environment to ensure that local content is actually effectively implemented.
Thanks, Charles. I'll ask you, as part of your recommendations, just to talk to any organizations in different counties right now for artisanal miners, talk to them, and then secondly, I want you to talk to the county governments. What do they need to do? And also talk to the national government. What do they need to do? And then talk to people seated here as CSOs and also academia. From your own perspective, what do we need to do to support you?
Thank you very much. As local miners, we need to move from the issue of actually begging or demanding or whatever. What we need to do is we need action. There is a say in my community that one who marries and every day and divorces every day will never see the grandchildren. Miners are ready to see the outcome and the benefits of the New Mining Act 2016. In that case, we are actually appealing to our partners to come to the rescue, especially for the local miners, because local miners have actually organized themselves. And what they need now, they don't need any empowerment anymore. They need action, that is licensing, so that they can have their formal activities formalized according to the New Mining Act 2016.
So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think that's it from us. And let's continue together. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So, what an intense day. What an intense day it has been. So I will just ask that we just rise on our feet so that we conclude together. I just want to make an announcement. Yeah, we have been sitting a little bit too long. I am informed that with our hashtag and on the Facebook part, we reached 1,454. That is quite a reach. That's quite a reach. There were more than 141 engagements, 10 shares, 6 comments, 20 likes, and on Zoom, we had 35, participants who were engaged, as you saw, with the questions and from different locations. And I think that was a very intense engagement. We had more than 28 of us in the room as it had been planned. So you can say that this was a very, very successful first day, and the input has been very intense. And I really thank you. Tomorrow, we want to start off in good time. Tomorrow, we want to start at 9 so that we are done completely by 12:30 tomorrow. So my request is that you come in slightly early. Wellington told me that he has some coffee for you to take before you start the meeting. So please come in slightly early and let us start at exactly 9 so that we take those 3 hours to conclude our meeting, our conference, and then we will proceed with the actions that we shall have adopted. So I want us to have the last round of applause and thank you so much for the critical input. And Wellington, you have a small announcement? Yeah? The screen has to go off. Okay, do I need to announce this? When the live screening goes off. Yeah, so the panelists can see Wellington. That is yeah, on that corner. The screens don't need to go off. They said that the panelists can see. So thank you so much. See you tomorrow before 9 in the morning. Thank you so much.